Hi there, friends. Shango Los from Shaping Fire, and I am here again with Dr. Ethan Russo, good friend of ours. And we are going to be talking about Cannabis Hyperemesis Syndrome today. And if you are new to CHS, I encourage you to listen to Shaping Fire episode 80, where Dr. Russo and I talk about Cannabis Hyperemesis Syndrome in detail. But today we are talking about CHS specifically to talk about Dr. Russo's new paper on the topic, debunking some of the myths that are being circulated about CHS. So the recent article we were discussing today is called Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, Genetic Susceptibility to Toxic Exposure. So Ethan, thank you for being here today. This new paper is very necessary to clear the air about what many people think the causes are to CHS and very freely share their opinions online about what causes CHS, but are not keeping up with the science. And your review paper's goal, as far as I understand it, is to help clear up those understandings. So as we move forward, both those of us who are cannabis enthusiasts and are susceptible to having CHS, but also all of us who speak online and to conferences so that we understand the state of the science and we can be spreading appropriate information. So let's start at the top. I think that for many people who are seeing this, they may be new to CHS as an ailment. So while people can find out all about it in detail on Shaping Fire episode 80, would you please just summarize for us what CHS is to bring everybody up to speed?
Sure, thanks, Shango. So, Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, or CHS, was first described 20 years ago in 2004 in Australia in 8 patients who presented, unbeknownst to each other, with a similar set of signs and symptoms, which consisted of nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and an unusual manifestation that they would spend hours at times taking hot showers or baths to reduce symptoms. And all of these were chronic users of high THC cannabis. So that was 20 years ago, but the description really hasn't changed. This syndrome has become more prevalent, it seems, some by virtue of recognition of the syndrome, but also associated with the higher potency cannabis and particularly concentrates that have become more generally available. It remains the case that this is far more prevalent in the US and Canada, where there is access to such materials as compared to the rest of the world.
So we are seeing an increased amount of CHS prevalence in people because the potency of the products that we have are increasing, and we're talking about to some degree higher THC flower, but really what we're talking about is oil concentrates and dabbing, right?
Quite often. In our survey published a couple of years ago, the average intake was 4 grams a day of high THC material among CHS sufferers.
Right on. So when we spoke during Shaping Fire episode 80, you were very clear that in the early days, we did not know what the cause was, which caused science to happen, right? And so you came on the show to talk about what was not the cause and what you had found was the cause or the pathway to the cause, which gave us a better idea of what we were dealing with. Now, I'm going to ask you in a moment to go through the list with me of the various things that you debunk in your new paper that are not the cause. But you were very clear on episode 80 that we do know what the genetic mutations are in a human that makes them susceptible to CHS. Let's cement that in right now. Will you describe the genetic mutations that are at the root of CHS?
Sure. So it was apparent to me over time that there was a small minority of cannabis users that seemed susceptible to CHS, and these were distinct from a lot of people we know that used high amounts of cannabis but had never had similar symptoms. So, what was the difference? Um, Although, as we'll discuss, people had implicated things like pesticides, the symptoms didn't match, and I felt that the cause of the susceptibility to CHS must be genetic, explaining why some people got it and some people did not. Um, so we really started there.
Mhm. And so I know for most folks, hearing you talk about the alleles will not be anything that anyone understands. But there are certainly people who are listening and watching who are legit scientists. So
Right.
for that, those folks in the audience, would you go through and hit where the mutations are?
Sure. So our first candidate was the gene that encodes the CB1 receptor, cannabinoid 1 receptor, where THC works, and our endocannabinoids, the cannabinoids within our body, work. But we didn't see a mutation there, and this will be important later, I think, when we discuss distinctions from other syndromes that are mistaken for CHS.
Okay.
Our other two hypotheses were that this had something to do with the enzymes that break down THC in the body, specifically something called CYP2C9. And we did see statistically significant difference that this gene or mutation on a gene, what's called a SNP or um, single nucleotide polymorphism, was present statistically significantly more in people with CHS as opposed to our control group, which was people who used high volumes of cannabis, again, averaging 4 grams a day, but did not have CHS. So we did see a mutation there. The third hypothesis, which also proved true, was a mutation on what's called TRPV1. TRPV1 is a receptor that has to do with pain and is triggered by heat and ethanol, otherwise known as alcohol, and acid. Um, and this mutation helped explain why the heat or capsaicin, the chili pepper extract on the skin, temporarily reduces symptoms. So those were two. We found two mutations on genes affecting dopamine. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter in the brain, and problems with it are associated with addiction, as well as psychosis, schizophrenia, and a whole host of other psychiatric problems. Having two genes that were statistically significantly present in the CHS group as compared to the high volume cannabis users that didn't have CHS, again indicated something important at the root of it. And we know that a drug that blocks dopamine, haloperidol, is one of the things that is used in emergency rooms to try to stop the nausea and vomiting, whereas more common drugs to treat nausea and vomiting don't work in this syndrome.
Mhm.
Finally, there was a mutation on a gene called ABCA1 that has to do with cholesterol metabolism. This is really unexpected, but has some important implications in that mutations there may make these people susceptible to Alzheimer's disease, coronary artery disease, and diabetes mellitus later in life.
So the reason why we're here is to remove some of the untrue information that's being spread around. And the impetus for Dr. Russo publishing this article is very specific. Would you please explain to us what happened to cause you to go through the effort to put out the paper?
Well, I'm afraid we're dealing with a post-truth world where science is being ignored or challenged. Um, but I kept hearing that, well, it must be this or it must be that. And people are really devoted to trying to disprove the fact that that CHS occurs due to cannabis usage or synthetic cannabinoids that hit the same CB1 receptor. So among these misconceptions have been pesticide exposure. Now, I am the first one to say that pesticides in cannabis is a huge problem where there isn't sufficient screening testing going on. I published on this in 2016 to show the rampant contamination that was present in the Washington state legal market. Uh, but the fact is, as bad as those chemicals are, and as many problems as they can create over time, the symptoms that they produce don't match CHS at all.
So people are very often online saying it's got to be pesticides or this this kind of pesticide or Eagle 20, or and then everybody's got an anecdotal story of how it happened to their uncle, cousin, trimmer, or whatever, right? But these individual stories do not add up to science because you have looked at a larger pool of both data and people.
Sure. Additionally, we've had people who've documented that the cannabis they used was from a home grow with no pesticide use at all. So it just doesn't fit.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of wishful thinking here in relation to this diagnosis.
So another category that is common to blame for CHS is neem. There's a lot of talk about, oh, people use neem, and this is what happens when you smoke cannabis that has been treated with neem, or worse so, when you concentrate it into an oil and then dab oil with neem in it. What does the science say?
Well, it really doesn't fit. And I take this one personally because I've used neem in my organic gardening for many years. And I admit I've eaten berries the same day I've sprayed with it, no repercussions. But that's only an anecdote. The truth is that neem is considered a safe organic pesticide for the most part. Um, eh, I scoured the literature on toxicities associated with neem oil, and it's one of its active ingredients called azadirachtin. And again, we've got a situation where the symptoms don't fit. There have been rare cases of toxicity, one associated with a suicide attempt, but we've got a mismatch. Additionally, azadirachtin has an extremely high boiling point. It's questionable that you would even recruit it out of cannabis by smoking, even though the lit tip of a cannabis joint is in the hundreds of degrees Celsius. So it really is a situation that once again can't explain the syndrome.
And again, wishful thinking too, right? Because we wish we could just point to, it is this chemical and let's just remove that.
Right.
But it's far more complex because the precursors are actually our genetic makeup.
Sure. Additionally, neem is typically used pre-flowering as the cannabis plant is growing. It dissipates entirely in 3 to 4 days. Um, and I just think if you did analyses for azadirachtin or neem on flower, you'd rarely find it, and the concentrations couldn't possibly explain the few cases of toxicity that have been observed, mostly in people who drank a some significant amount of a neem or azadirachtin fluid.
And even if somebody was ill-advised and they used neem in the seventh week of flower or something, um, while that is not going to be a necessarily good experience for the cannabis enthusiast, the diagnoses for CHS are so spread out with so many different sources that we know that a very rare opportunity like that is not going to be the cause.
No, again, statistics would not explain this.
Right on. Another potential or rumored cause for CHS that you debunk in the paper is hop latent viroid. And so, would you go through that analysis too?
Sure. So a viroid is sort of a primitive virus, and this has been rampant in the cultivation of cannabis. It does stunt the growth of the plant and can limit its potency. But here's the thing. it not only has there never been a case of hop latent viroid showed in a human, there are no cases of any plant virus or viroid affecting humans. We're sufficiently different from plants, fellow living creatures, but we're sufficiently different that there's no likelihood that any infectious agent of this type could affect a human, let alone with CHS.
So now we get to the big one. So we'll come at this a couple different ways. The first is that as the definition of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome evolved, some were wondering if it was cyclic vomiting syndrome. And then recently we have run into that a significant scientific journal grouped them together, which got your dander up and you wanted to clarify.
Sure.
So I'd like you to do both at the same time.
Right.
Would you address what cyclic vomiting is, how it is not CHS, and the error that's made in the scientific journal?
Sure. So this was in the journal Gastroenterology, and they said basically that CHS was a subset of cyclic vomiting syndrome. I took umbrage at this because CVS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, is something that I'm very familiar with as a neurologist, particularly as a pediatric neurologist. So CVS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, typically presents in a child or a teenager who has episodic nausea and vomiting without other explanation. And they might get an advanced workup, invasive studies, scans, you name it. But what this is what's known as a form fruste, frustrated form of migraine. The natural history of cyclic vomiting syndrome is this is a child or teenager who has a family history of migraine, typically their mother, and they get symptoms of nausea and vomiting without a headache. But as they get older, the migraine with the headache will establish itself. Interestingly, cyclic vomiting syndrome, like many forms of migraine, is very amenable to treatment with cannabis, whether it be acutely or as a preventive. But you can see how this has created confusion. However, I'm quite critical in that people with nausea and vomiting typically end up in emergency departments, and unless the doctor is willing to spend the time to really ask the right questions, it's simple to have this confusion. Finally, can we really tell the difference? Well, in fact, there is that mutation on the CB1 gene, CNR1. Um, there is a mutation in the cyclic vomiting syndrome that we did not find in the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome patients. So we have the capability of distinguishing these based on laboratory testing.
So I want to finish up talking about the various cannabinoids and their role in CHS, but I want to hit this. I want to summarize what you just said very clearly. That while we are still researching CHS, we have got enough science done at this point that we understand that CHS is not caused by pesticides. It's not caused by neem, and it's not CVS. And what we know is that to develop CHS, you must have the pre-existing gene mutations, and then you need to imbibe a whole lot of cannabis, generally speaking, upwards of 4 grams of concentrate a day, generally speaking, with each person being having some variation. Do I have the summary right?
Yeah, pretty much. Everybody might have a different threshold for this. I should also point out that anybody who suddenly has exposure to too high a dose of THC may get sick and vomit, but that's very different from having this chronic cyclic situation. Um, so we really are able to distinguish. It does require actually talking to patients in detail, which is really not the model of current medicine in this country, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk about how you finished the paper, which I found very interesting because, as somebody who is in cannabis media, I get reached out to by people who are experiencing CHS, and they're, by definition, they're a cannabis enthusiast, right? They're using a lot of cannabis every day, which is how that, in cooperation with their gene mutations, causes these symptoms. And so people say, "Oh, I'm going to try to switch to just doing CBD, or I'm going to switch to just CBG, or for this particular autoimmune, I'm going to try just THCA." And your paper goes through each of the popular cannabinoids that patients have tried to shift through, kind of denying the doom scenario of actually not being able to use cannabis anymore. And now we have research that talks about why trying to shift to another cannabinoid is not really going to help. Would you delineate that?
Sure. So again, we've implicated herbal cannabis and THC in triggering CHS symptoms, but it will occur with any drug or cannabinoid that stimulates the CB1 receptor. So this would include synthetic delta 8. It would include cannabinol, CBN. It might involve CBD. And the problem there is twofold. Number one, it's extremely hard to uh, have a CBD preparation that isn't going to have some amount of THC. That's one. Um, and two is that CBD over time may increase anandamide levels, and this possibly also is a trigger to CHS symptoms if the levels are too high. Um, so there are those. You mentioned CBG. As you know, we've done a lot of work on published on cannabigerol. I think it's a wonderful agent. It is not intoxicating. It does not stimulate the CB1 receptor with any particular potency. On its own, it's not an antiemetic. It's not one that's usually used for vomiting. It likely could be helpful in reducing anxiety with the syndrome and possibly the pain, but I doubt it would be an effective preventive on its own. There are CBG only plants and preparations that are available in contrast to CBD, which, unless it was developed from an isolate, is unlikely. You mentioned the acid cannabinoids. THCA is antiemetic. It helps reduce vomiting. But the problem is it's not stable, and its breakdown product is THC.
Yeah.
So one sees the pitfall there potentially. How about CBDA, cannabidiolic acid? So this is CBD before it's decarboxylated. In animals, that has a strong antiemetic effect. We don't have enough information from anybody who's tried this to know whether CBDA on its own might be helpful in this situation. Right now, the only effective treatment that will work in the long term is abstinence from cannabis or other agents that stimulate CB1, and that includes synthetic cannabinoids because it's well established in people that aren't using herbal cannabis but have had CHS in relation to the synthetic agents that stimulate the CB1 receptor.
All right. So let's look forward. So you have been right on the front lines of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome for the whole 20 years that we've been looking at it. You have been following the research from the early days when it was first defined and described. You have participated in most of the early research, so you know where we're at today. You have spent efforts through this paper debunking the things that it is not, so that we have a better grasp of what CHS is, both so that we can research it, and so we have good information going throughout the cannabis scene. I'm curious to know where you would like to see research happen next to further our understanding of CHS and hopefully relieve the symptoms of the cannabis enthusiasts that are developing it.
Sure. So we have plans now. We'd like to, uh, we're involved in putting together a consortium of researchers to apply to the National Institutes of Health for a grant to study CHS in depth. We would like to have hundreds of patients who undergo the genomic testing to look at the 5 gene candidates that we've identified and possibly others. Additionally, we'd like to do metabolomic testing. This would involve a sample of saliva that's analyzed for its chemical composition to see if a CHS attack produces biochemical changes that we can identify as markers. Um, so that would be part of it. Additionally, we need much better investigation of the psychiatric accompaniments to CHS, which we've mentioned. The tendency towards addiction, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and others. Um, so that's the idea of the research. It would be very expensive. So in this instance, we need a grant. We'll try the government. We'll see. I'm not confident that there's going to be great funding opportunities in biomedical research at a federal level.
So, for people who are interested to know more about CHS or want to get involved, clearly there's Shaping Fire episode 80, where you can get the in-depth look at CHS. But what if people want to get involved financially in supporting their work? Would they contact your company, Credo Science, that way if they want to get involved with funding?
Sure. Couple of things. First, the 3 papers that we've published on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome are available free, no copyright problems, because it's my personal website, at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. In the search engine, if you put hyperemesis, HYPEREMESIS, yeah, that's
There,
right.
there will also be links at the bottom of this
Right.
video, so you don't have to write it down.
And finally, we have a website. What is CHS? That's what dash is dash chs.com, that has a resource page with links to the articles again, more information at a nice level that I think is easy to understand, and access to the CHS screening test that is available commercially.
Great. Well, Dr. Russo, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your life's research as well. And thank you also for, a lot of people think of ivory tower science, and sometimes scientists don't get involved with the nitty-gritty of it, but you are very you are part and parcel of the cannabis scene, and I appreciate you having the interest in debunking some of this incorrect information, because all of us who enjoy cannabis are at risk. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for your research.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Right on. Thank you, friends. So thank you for being here today. If you want to learn more, that's Shaping Fire episode 80. And you can look for the links to Dr. Russo's websites below this one. For Shaping Fire, I am Shango Los. Thanks for being here.